Welcome to Equip, Build, Mature. As I like to do on Saturdays, I want to do an overview of one of the books of the Bible. Today we're going to be looking at the book of Zephaniah. So, who wrote the document of Zephaniah? When Zephaniah 1:1, the author introduced himself, Zephaniah, son of Cushai, son of Gedaliah, son of Amariah, son of Hezekiah. This is a very unique introduction of a prophet with its long list of fathers back to Zephaniah's great-great-grandfather, Hezekiah. Zephaniah probably stopped with Hezekiah to emphasize his royal lineage as a descendant of one of Judah's good kings. The reference to this place in verse 4 indicates that Zephaniah prophesied in the city of Jerusalem. His many references to temple worship indicates that he was very familiar with Israel's religious culture. So all of these facts together describe a man who was at the center of Judah's political and religious world. He was friends with those in power. So this would have given his hard message an even greater impact. So what time exactly does this take place in history? Well, the book tells us that Zephaniah prophesied during the rule of Josiah. And Josiah was Judah's king from 640 to 609 BC. So we can determine exactly when Zephaniah prophesied by noticing a few details in the text. First, in chapter 2, verse 13, the prophet predicted the fall of Nineveh, and that happened in 612 BC. Secondly, Zephaniah often quoted from the law. For example, compare chapter 1, verse 13 to Deuteronomy chapter 28, verses 30 and 39. Remember, the law had been lost in Judah for much of Josiah's reign. So Zephaniah probably prophesied in the last part of Josiah's rule, after the king discovered the scrolls of the law. That was in 622 BC. And you can read that in 2 Chronicles chapter 34, verses 3 to 7. So all of this tells us that Zephaniah grew up under the rule of those that came before Josiah. His grandfather, the evil king Manasseh, and Manasseh's son, the young and evil Ammon. As a young man, and before he was a prophet, Zephaniah would have been surrounded by everything associated with idolatry, child sacrifice, and unjust killings. Those are strong influences on a young mind. You can read this in 2 Kings chapter 21, verse 16, and 2 Chronicles chapter 33, verses 1 to 10. But regardless, Zephaniah grew into a man of God. He became able to stand before the people and proclaim God's message of judgment and hope to those who had strayed far from God. So why is the book of Zephaniah so important for us? Well, the book mentions the day of the Lord more than any other book in the Old Testament. The phrase clearly describes Judah's fall to Babylon. The phrase also refers to and describes the eventual judgment on all humanity and the restoration of those that live by faith in Jesus in the future. So the immediate audience, the immediate audience would have understood the phrase to primarily refer to the soon to take place judgment of God against the nation of Judah. In the day of the Lord, Zephaniah saw the destruction of his nation, his neighbors, and eventually the entire earth. We see this in chapter 1, verse 2, and verse 4, and then in chapter 2, verse 10. Zephaniah wrote that the day of the Lord was near. We see this in chapter 1, verse 14. So that means the day of the Lord would be a time of wrath in chapter 1, verse 15. And it would come as a judgment on sin, and that's in chapter 1, verse 17. And it would ultimately result in the blessing of God's people being allowed in his presence. Chapter 3, verse 17. So, what is the big idea of the book of Zephaniah? Well, this book, like the writings of many of the prophets, follows a pattern of judgment on all people because of their sin. And this is followed by God restoring his covenant people. Zephaniah's primary target for God's message of judgment was the nation of Judah. They had fallen into serious sin under the reign of their king Manasseh. And we see that Zephaniah's prophecy cried out for godliness and purity in a nation that was sinful to its core. The people of Judah had long ago turned their backs on God in their personal lives and in their worship. This reflected the depth of their sin, and it revealed the deep need for God's people to be cleansed so that they could be restored by God. How are we supposed to apply this book of Zephaniah to our lives now in the 21st century? Well, those living in Judah had turned the worship of God into a great disaster. They built their own places of worship to exalt man-made gods. In the Old Testament, those places were called high places. They also began to defile the temple. At that time, it was still the dwelling place of God's name, chapter 1, verse 9. Today, if you and I live in open sin, we also show contempt for God, and our worship has no value to God. We should never approach God with a false face, hypocrisy. We should never be satisfied with looking religious to the people around us, but not behaving with the heart of God. Zephaniah is a good reminder of how very serious God is about our life and our relationship with him. If you fail to live to please God, and if you fail to worship as God asks, remember the message of Zephaniah 3. God is always a God of restoration and hope if and when you and I repent. Guys, hope you have a great day. Thanks for sharing a few moments with me here, and let's always continue to remember what Zephaniah had to say and the importance of confessing our sin to God, being true to God. Take care.